There is a common and widely believed slogan that floats around the church. It is a slogan that contains an unspoken conclusion. So here is the slogan. In reference to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, I will hear people say, "You know, Nathan, the Bible isn't a science book." The Bible isn't a science book. Well, I would agree that's a true statement. This is not a science book. But in reality, what they're really saying is they're giving us a premise and an unspoken conclusion. When they say the Bible isn't a science book, there's a pregnant pause, and there's usually a therefore that should be coming, or perhaps it's left unspoken. The idea is, Nathan, the Bible isn't a science book, therefore, any truth claims that you make out of Genesis chapter 1, 2, or any of the other chapters, should you really be making those? Should you really be speaking on the creation of men and women, of evolution, of science, of cosmology, the Big Bang, the 6-day? Can you really speak about those things because the Bible isn't a science book? Well, though the premise is true, the conclusion, I believe, is absurd, because if we take this same line of reasoning, let's compare it to many other things. For example, in the book of John, Jesus is at a wedding, and they're saying, hey, there's no more wine. And so what do we find? That at the beginning of the wedding, they bring out the great wine, and then at the end of the wedding, when people are a little happy because they've been drinking, they bring out the garbage wine. Well, they ran out, and so they go to Jesus, hey, we're out of wine. Hint, hint. So he turns the water into the wine, and it ends up being very good wine. And so with that same line of reasoning, I might say, you know what? The Bible is not a book on sommeliers. And you're making a truth claim about wine, and this is not a wine book. Or, here's another one. We have the story of Zacchaeus, and you remember he was a wee little man. Some of you got it. And he was a criminal. He was a thief, and he has this come to Jesus moment, literally with Jesus, where his life turns around, and he has this kind of cathartic experience where suddenly something inside of him has snapped, he's changed, and he's filled with joy, and he wants to repay everyone that he's ever ripped off. And so I might say, wow, this was a really a change in this man's life. There was catharsis, and you might say, you know, Nathan, this is not a psychology textbook. And you're making psychological truth claims about this man's mental state. And therefore, can you really say that? Or there was a man who was born blind from birth, and John was there, he saw it, and he reported on it, and the man's parents said he was born blind, and the man himself declared he was born blind. Jesus healed him, and what do we find? We find that suddenly he says, I was blind, but now I can see. You know, Nathan, this is not a textbook on ophthalmology. I had to practice that several times to say that. Can you really make a truth claim about ophthalmology? You see, this idea is silly. The Bible is full of all kinds of truth claims, and some of them might be scientific, some of them might be psychological, some of them might have to do with medical things, and some of them might have to do with wine. The Bible is filled with truth claims, and just because it's not a science textbook doesn't mean we can't consider these truth claims. So the question that we're asking today, as we get into the book of Genesis, and as we look at Genesis chapter 1, and we start to deal with the issue of creation and evolution and all the stuff that you've heard debate for many, many decades, we're asking the question, how should godly men and women, how should Christians interact with science as we consider Genesis chapter 1? And so our title is Faith, Science, and Worldly Wisdom. And I want to review what we've been looking at so far. We've been journeying through the background and the pre-creation events of Genesis chapter 1. We discovered that Genesis was part of a single book called the Book of Moses. Moses wrote this book and delivered it to the next generation of men and women who would cross the Jordan and go into the promised land under the leadership of Joshua. And on Wednesdays, we've been looking at Mosaic authorship. And in fact, we recently considered the internal and external evidence for Mosaic authorship. And we even looked at 7 different archaeological finds over the last 100 years that gave evidence toward a traditional understanding of the book of Genesis and Mosaic authorship. Last week, on Sunday morning, we considered the concept of an uncaused cause. How can there be a person before space and time and matter? And what we looked at was that there are solid, logical, reasonable, and philosophical arguments for a self-actualized prime mover that we find in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, which says, "In the beginning, God." Today, we're going to tackle the daunting issue in Genesis by examining the concept of science. So if you would, turn your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 4, and we're going to be reading verses 29 to 34. In the story, King Solomon is now the king of a united Israel. And from his father David, young Solomon inherited a kingdom that was established. It was largely free from foreign enemies, and it was devoid of internal strife. And so when it came time for him to take the throne, the Lord immediately began working in his life, and the Lord appeared to Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 3 and basically said, "Solomon, you're king. What do you want? What can I do for you?" And so Solomon makes a few statements, but his request is found in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 8 to 9, and this is what he says to the Lord. "Your servant in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this great people?" So as we look at this text, we understand that essentially Solomon asked for 2 things. He asked for an understanding mind, not just to have an understanding mind, but so that he could govern. But he also asked for the ability to discern between good and evil. So this is what he asked, and then here's how the Lord responds in 1 Kings 3. "It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And God said to him, because you have asked this, and you have not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but you have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you." Now, notice that Solomon did not ask for wisdom. Solomon asked for an understanding and discerning mind, and the Lord gave him wisdom on top of that. And so Solomon asked for 2 things, and the Lord gave him 3. So now he's firmly established as the king of a united Israel. He's got wisdom, he's got understanding, he's got discernment. And in 1 Kings chapter 4, we see how this plays out. So let's check this out. 1 Kings chapter 4, starting with verse 29. I'm reading from the ESV. "And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore. So that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all other men, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite." That's apparently someone very smart. "And He-Man," which I think it's pronounced Heman, but it's really just fun to say He-Man when you're preaching. "Calcol and Darda, the sons of Mahol. And his fame was in all the surrounding nations." Verse 32. "He also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts, and of birds, and of reptiles, and of fish. And the people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom." What we find as we study the scripture as a whole is that there's different types of wisdom that exist in the world, different types of learning. And on one side, there is foolish and corrupt wisdom, foolish and corrupt learning. And we find this all over the scripture. We know that the magicians of the country of Egypt, they were considered to be wise men, but they were magicians and sorcerers and so on. And so we wouldn't accept this type of wisdom. Paul speaks of worldly wisdom in 1 Corinthians 3:19. He says this worldly wisdom is folly. And in Colossians 2, he talks about that we should watch out for hollow and deceptive philosophy. In 1 Timothy 6, he talks about avoiding irreverent babble and so-called knowledge. And so we understand that in the world that there is worldly wisdom, worldly knowledge, and worldly philosophy that's not grounded in a biblical worldview and is bankrupt. And yet simultaneously, we read from the scripture that there is knowledge, there is critical thinking, there is learning that is of great value to God's people. And when Moses needed leaders to lead, the Lord instructed him, hey, I want you to get wise, understanding, and experienced people to lead. And so what we find from this story in the book of 1 Kings chapter 4 is that Solomon is lifted up as a virtuous man, a man after the Lord's own heart, like his father, a man who is interested in a wide breadth of learning and knowledge. And so I want to demonstrate through the scripture all of the various topics that Solomon was interested in examining. Look at the topics in which he invested. We find first that Solomon was interested in ethics. It says that his wisdom surpassed all people, that he prayed for discernment in good and evil. Here's a man who came before the Lord and said, I need you to show me what is right, what is wrong, where are the boundaries, what is good, what is evil. And Solomon had proverbs for righteousness. So we see in the scripture that there was what we would call the topic of ethics. And Solomon was studying and mastering this topic. But we also find what we later on would call sociology. That is, Solomon had proverbs for wise dealing. That is, how do we deal with each other? I have neighbors, I have friends, I have family, I have people at work, people in which we're engaged in trade and commerce. How do we deal with each other? How do we function together? And he had proverbs for wise insight and instruction. And so we see sociological learning going on here in the court of Solomon. But we also find teaching on educational theory. And that is in Proverbs 1:4, Solomon taught on how to instruct the unlearned and the next generation. So how do we, as God's people, pass on the knowledge of God from our generation to the next one? How do we teach our kids right and wrong? Solomon studied this. We go on to number 4, economics. Solomon revived the economy in 1 Kings. And the economy was so awesome that silver became very common. And then we find, of course, the women of Proverbs 31, who was a wise and thrifty capitalist type of woman. And so what do we find? We find the study of economics going on in the Old Testament. We also find the study of law and justice. Solomon wrote proverbs concerning justice. He wrote proverbs concerning fair scales and measurements within society. So understand, as Solomon is out there learning and teaching, he's looking at ethics, he's looking at sociology, he's looking at educational theory, he's looking at economics, he's looking at law and justice, but he's also looking at politics and leadership. And that is, from the very beginning of Mosaic leadership over the nation, how do we appoint wise and understanding people to lead us? We also know that he looked at language, literature, and critical thinking. 1 Kings tells us that Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs. He taught on how to understand proverbs. He taught on how to understand sayings. He taught on how to understand riddles. Well, riddle me this. Why is that important? Well, they use the word riddles. We might say that he was examining paradoxes, mysteries, or apparent contradictions. So he's out there learning and teaching on language, literature, critical thinking. And it goes even further where he, of course, is well educated in teaching about music. It says that he wrote 1,005 songs himself. He was basically the Chris Tomlin of his time. And we learned earlier that David appointed music directors who understood music. And then we go on to even the natural sciences, where Solomon spoke of trees and plants and beasts and birds and reptiles and fish. You see, our modern understanding of science, of course, didn't exist, but the ancients, like Solomon, included a study of nature, and they observed animals, they named them, they speculated on things like motion and light and gravity, and they studied the celestial bodies above. And then finally, number 10, there was a bunch of other things that they looked at, and this would be medicine and architecture and metallurgy and maritime technology. In other words, what we find is that the leader of this theocracy, of God's people, wasn't just out there saying, well, we just need to study theology. All that other stuff is godly stuff. No. Solomon had this breadth of understanding, of learning and wisdom, and he wanted all of it. And it's lifted up as a good thing. It is a good thing to study ethics and sociology and educational theory and economics and law and justice and politics and language and music and natural sciences and all these other things. This is a good thing. And so I want to make a statement, and this is our big idea for today, that Christians proceeding from a biblical worldview should be humble, vocal, and discerned aficionados of all good wisdom and knowledge. That you and I, my friends, we should be, from a biblical perspective, a biblical worldview, humble, vocal, and discerned aficionados of all good wisdom and knowledge. We should want to learn all of this stuff. We are allowed to learn it. We are encouraged to learn it. And in fact, what we find is that some of the early church fathers even agreed with this, of course. We have Augustine of Hippo. He said, a person who is a good and true Christian should realize that truth belongs to his Lord wherever it is found, gathering and acknowledging it even in pagan literature, but rejecting superstitious vanities. Augustine is saying, look, there's truth out there, and you can find it in physics, you can find it in science, you can find it in medicine, you can find it in psychology. Is there corruption? Of course, but if it's true, then it's good. Here's John Calvin on his commentary on Titus. He says, all truth is from God, and consequently, if wicked men have said anything that is true and just, we ought not to reject it, for it has come from God. This, then, should give us a good foundation as we consider our first verb in Genesis chapter 1. Remember, this is the fifth word. We're in the fifth word so far in the book of Genesis. It says, in the beginning, God, what did he do? He created. And thus, the natural world came into existence for the first time. And science is the study of the natural world. And so the Bible is making truth claims about the natural world, and science is the study of this natural world. And so we should have an understanding of science so that we can interact with Genesis chapter 1 and 2 and also with this area of learning. So first, what I want to look at is definition and method. And you might say, well, what gives you the right, Nathan, to speak on this? Well, we'll get to that in a second. But remember, this stuff is basic stuff. And I took science classes in college. I by no means have a science degree. But this is very, very beginning introductory stuff. So what is a good definition of science? Well, I'll use the phrase from one of my professors. And he said that science is the study of the natural world. It's very easy. Here's a definition from Grok. You might say, who's Grok? Grok is the AI that's attached to Twitter, also known as X. I asked Grok, what is science? And Grok said, science is the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. Well, sounds like he knows what he's talking about. Here's another one. This was on the UC Berkeley's science portion of their website. That science is both a process and a body of knowledge. And I like that because the first two definition talks about a process, like what is it? But then the third definition includes that it's a body of knowledge. So it is a study of the natural world which builds up a body of knowledge. So science is the body of knowledge. That's a noun, but also a verb. It's the process of studying this natural world. And so what about the scientific method? Well, obviously from this chart, you can see it's super easy. I was looking at the Encyclopedia Britannica. I was on the American Museum of Natural History, and some of this stuff, like I said, doesn't need to be cited because it's so simple and it's so introductory. What is the scientific method? Well, it begins by asking questions and observing. You simply see something, you ask questions, you observe, and then you hypothesize, which is an educated guess, a guess based upon some data. And then you gather data and you test the data and you test it against the hypothesis. And then you rinse and repeat and then you draw conclusions. So this is very, very simple stuff. So we have a definition, we have a method. And so what I would argue is that science is from God, science is good, and science is a means of natural revelation. So like all learning and knowledge, this is a good thing. And when we study the natural world, we are studying the handiwork of our Creator. And when we study the handiwork of our Creator, we gain insights into our Creator. And so, friends, Christianity is not anti-science. They are not against each other. These are not opposite sides of a binary choice here. In fact, many of the early leaders of the scientific revolution were either deists or Christians, and many top scientists today are deists and Christians. Can you find some fringe Christian against science? Well, certainly, but you can find fringe weirdos everywhere. But Christianity itself is not anti-science. Solomon was lifted up as a virtuous leader because he was examining all areas of knowledge. We do, however, need to discuss the limitations of science. Now, there was a debate many decades ago between William Craig Lane and Darwinist Peter Atkins. And during the debate, Peter Atkins, the Darwinist, said, "There is no need for God." And he argued everything in the world can be understood without needing to evoke a God. And then he asked William Craig Lane the question, do you deny that science can account for everything? And Craig said, yes, I do deny that science can account for everything. So what can't it account for? Demanded Atkins. And it was here that William Craig Lane laid out 5 indisputable limitations on science that I'm going to share with you today. The first one is logic and mathematics. You see, logic and mathematics cannot be proven by science because science presupposes them. In order to even function first, science must presuppose science and math. And remember from last week that logic and math could exist before space, time, and matter. But in order to have science, you must have the material world. So you have logic and math, which existed before space, time, and matter, but space, time, and matter were later created. And so logic and math science needs and presupposes logic and math. Now here's another one. Metaphysical truths. As an example, consider what is called the 5-minute hypothesis. Now, the 5-minute hypothesis was an idea put forth by staunch atheist Bertrand Russell once again in his 1921 book, Analysis of the Mind. And he argues that existence, or the creation, that we are here, he says, this could have been created 5 minutes ago. And all of our history, all of our knowledge, all of your memories could have just been put into place. And how would you possibly know? His point is not to argue for creationism, of course not. He was arguing for extreme skepticism in the face of evidence-based knowledge. So if I go through and I do dendrochronology on trees and I say, well, this tree is this many years old, he's saying, well, how do you know this wasn't created 5 minutes ago? You can't know this. And so the idea here is, how can you know through science if we are real, or if we exist, or if somebody else exists? We can't know this stuff. Metaphysical and philosophical beliefs really aren't affected by science, and so this cannot be measured by science. Here's another one, ethics and morality. You can't use science to tell you what is right and wrong. Now, certainly science can update you on what might be right or wrong, but let me give you an example. 50 years ago, we didn't really know what was going on inside the womb of a woman who was pregnant, but we know now that heartbeats can be discerned as early as 5.5 weeks, and this can be verified. It's testable, repeatable, and provable. We also know, and there's debate on this time frame, but generally most would say that by 24 weeks a baby can feel pain. Some would argue that it's earlier, but whatever. The point is that science can tell us that a baby has a heartbeat and that a baby reacts to pain, but it still can't tell us whether it's right or wrong to be able to abort a child. It can't tell us. Science can't tell us that. Here's number 4, aesthetics and beauty. Science can't tell me why we love this poem or this song or this piano piece or this style of architecture. Certainly science can help create those things, but it can't say if something is hideous or lovely. Unless, of course, it's onions, because everyone knows that science, philosophy, and theology has proven that onions are gross and nobody should eat them. But that's a whole other issue. And here's the 5th one, that science cannot confirm the scientific method itself. In other words, the statement, science is the only source of objective truth, that's a philosophical statement that can't be verified by science. Now, once again, science is slave to logic, reason, philosophy, metaphysics, ethics, and beauty. And because science is a slave to philosophy, it can get distorted, misused, and can become unscientific. Now, let me give you a few examples of distorted science. All right. Now, remember, science itself and the scientific method is good. Solomon studied it. Solomon learned it. We would affirm that this is a good thing. This is a good tool in the hands and in the minds of God's people. And so what we would say is, here's this picture of a sign. Notice it's a happy sign. It's bright. It's clean. It's crisp. Everyone loves it. But there's one problem, is here you have a tool that God has given us, and when this tool falls into the hands of people, then this is what happens. Science can become corrupted. How? Well, by fame, by money, by politics, by funding, by philosophy, by religion, by worldview, by presupposition. So here you have something that's good, that is a gift of God to his people, but when it gets into the hands of people, then we mess it up like we do most things. Let me give you some examples of distorted science. We'll start with past history. This is the cover of Copernicus's book that he wrote in the 1500s, and he's the one that came up with the idea of a heliocentric galaxy, or solar system. So basically, it was believed that the Earth was the center and everything revolved around the Earth. Well, people started learning math that is way above my pay grade. And they were looking at mathematical models, they were observing, and they're saying, this doesn't add up. And someone came up with the idea, aka Copernicus, that maybe everything isn't spinning around the Earth, maybe the sun is the center and everything's spinning around the sun. Well, guess what happened? That went against established science. It was wrong. It was bad. And he was so afraid to even publish his work that he waited until he was almost dead to do it. And then his work was banned because we have our bulwark of information and you're not allowed to challenge it. Well, then in 1663, Galileo comes along and he starts pushing this and verifying it and writing about it. And what happens? He gets put on trial. Why? Because this view is wrong. It's established science that the Earth is the center and you're not allowed to publish this stuff. So he was forced to recant and then put on house arrest for life. Now, you see, sometimes this is used as an example of the conflict between faith and religion, but I think it's a better example of science being distorted by an existing power structure. A power structure that says, we have our beliefs, and your science is not allowed to change anything. So this is, of course, past history. As we move into what I would call the pre-COVID era, I remember watching this movie in the theater, 2009's Ben Stein's Expelled. It's a documentary about how academia excludes any research that talks about intelligent design. In other words, you have to believe that the universe came about by purely natural means, that out of nothing came something. And you're not allowed to bring any research that says otherwise. And so he talks about that. Or what about, say, the Sokol affair? Now, this is interesting. In 2009, a group of guys got together, and they understand that there's these academic journals, psychological journals, sociological journals, scientific journals, and they said, I wonder how well the gates of these journals are guarded. What if we write some completely fake, fabricated, and scientifically bunk articles, and we'll see if we can get them published. And guess what? They got them published all over the place. They published stuff in physical and journals of physics, medicine, computer science, and sociology. And what they did is they made sure that their research, and it wasn't even research, had a favorability bent. In other words, I know the environment, I know what people want to hear, I know what people like, and so we're going to create fake articles with a bent of what people want, and guess what? They got published. Scientific journals published junk because it happened to say some things that they liked. Or I think about what happened in 2006. There was a researcher by the name of Sylvia Lesney, and this researcher came up with the amyloid plaque hypothesis. It talks about when you have dementia or Alzheimer's, the theory is that there's a type of plaque in the brain, and this is what's causing it. Well, the research was very broad, and decades of research was then built upon it until 2022. They found out that work was a big fraud, and everything kind of came crumbling down. It was fraud science. Now, we move into the post-COVID era, and we begin to see this sort of fraud speed up. And of course, it brings us into what some might call the political realm, which I'm not trying to be political, but I'm sorry, we have some issues that we had to deal with in our culture. The first one is what is called the Great Barrington Declaration. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but this was a declaration where medical doctors, PhDs, scientists, lots of people got together, and they put their name, their title, their degree, and where they worked. They signed this document. So as of yesterday, 47,000 medical practitioners and 16,000 medical and public health scientists signed this document. And this was started being signed in 2020 in the early phases of the pandemic. And what were they signing? They were saying that we don't think the narrative that is being put out there, that is lockdowns, masks, and isolation, is the best way to handle this crisis based upon science. And guess what? Nobody ever heard of this because it was suppressed. And if you went to someone and said, I don't think this is the best way to handle it, they say, you can't say that. You don't have an MD. You're not a virologist. You're not allowed to say this. And yet, here we have thousands and thousands and thousands of scientists, MDs, PhDs, who risk their jobs and their livelihood to sign a document saying, no, there's another way to handle this. Here's another one. This was an article in CBS and in NBC that happened earlier this year. Two articles. One says that the earth is beginning to spin faster. And then the same day, another article says that the earth is beginning to slow down. So which is it? Now, you might think that I'm coming down on science, and I'm not saying that science is bad. I'm simply saying that we as people get it wrong. Because why? There's fame, there's money, there's politics, there's funding, there's philosophy, there's religion, there's worldviews at work here. And then what about this article from Forbes? This guy worked, I think, for the CDC, and what did he say? You remember going to the grocery stores, there was lines, you have to stand 6 feet apart, you've got to line up to do it this way. Why? Because within 6 feet, you are in the danger zone. Well, what did we find out? That this was totally arbitrary, that it was made up, and it was sort of based on some data from a flu 100 years before. In other words, they made this up, they called it science, and if you questioned it, you were anti-science. What about all of the COVID deaths? I had two friends who were firsthand witnesses. One of my friends, again, I know her personally. She told me this herself, that she was working in an ER. A guy came in. He had died from a motorcycle accident. And in the data, in the input, it says that he died from COVID. That's not science. And if you questioned it, you were called anti-science. What about the CDC's hidden myocardial memo? This is from The Hill. Basically what happened is there was a Freedom of Information request, and it was found in May of 2022 that the CDC was saying, there were emails going back and forth saying, we think there might be a risk of heart problems in young males particularly. And they didn't release it. Why? Well, that's a good question. But it went back and forth, and then later, months and months and months later, then they begin to release it. And of course, just 3 days ago, the AstraZeneca company, they pulled their vaccine after admitting that it can cause blood clots. Once again, I want to make very clear, I'm not I'm not making any comments about vaccine. Whatever you believe is fine. I'm simply saying that what people refer to as science was being filtered, twisted, distorted by someone who had an agenda. So friends, I've given you 9 quick examples. There are many more. Once again, I'm not saying science is bad or that scientists are bad. By no means. I'm only arguing that science is good, but it can be distorted, once again, by people. Just like any field of study, from theology to underwater basket weaving. So the next question that someone might ask is, well, why do you think you have a right, a non-scientist, to speak on scientific things? Easy. 1, because you and I can spot corrupting influences. You see, if there is science, but it's been corrupted, then it's no longer science. You're not speaking out against science, you're speaking out against fraud. You don't need to have a theology degree to go into a church and say, whoa, this church is wacky, something is not right here. You don't have to have an advanced degree to see contradictions or lies or frauds. And so we can and should speak out because we can see corrupting influences. The other reason we can speak is because that logic and reason overrules science. Logic and math existed before the creation of space, time, and matter, and science is the study of the material world, and anyone who uses logic and reason can then speak on matters of science, so long as they are careful not to fall into certain logical fallacies. But the third reason is that you might not be a virologist, you might not be a cosmologist, you might not be whatever ologist you want to name, but you can leverage them. In other words, I'm not a virologist, but if I get into an argument with, say, a doctor, I can say, look, I understand you have more education than I do, but look at the Great Barrington Declaration, where thousands of MDs and PhDs sign this. You might not be a climate scientist, but you can find credible research on climate science that offers a different view. You might not be a geologist, but you can find experts, credible experts in geology, who will give you a counter view. You might not be a cosmetologist and cosmologist, very different. You might not be a cosmologist, but you can find research from credible cosmologists who take a different view. And so, my friends, do not let your voices be marginalized by poor critical thinking. You can speak, and you should speak if you are using humility, critical thinking, and leveraging credible experts. And so I will gladly debate someone on science, not from my own scientific background, by using logic, critical thinking, by spotting corruption and saying, but here are a bunch of MDs and PhDs who are backing what I am saying. Now, this leads us to the important issue of framing. You see, in the marketplace, with the debate over the age of the earth and evolution and creation, it's almost always framed in a way that pits science against religion. What they'll say is, well, look, okay, I get it. You're a Christian. You're a person of faith. And I respect that. But I'm a person of science. That this is a binary choice. You can't be both. These are irreconcilable. But this is absolutely unnecessary. The true framing of the debate is science proceeding from one worldview and science proceeding from another worldview. It's science versus science. Now, consider the work of Elaine Howard Eklund. She did a 4-year research project and was getting into the minds, what do scientists actually think on religion? And here's a snippet from her book. After 4 years of research, at least one thing becomes clear. Much of what we believe about the faith lives of elite scientists is wrong. The insurmountable hostility between science and religion is a caricature, a thought cliche, perhaps useful as a satire on groupthink, but hardly representative of reality. In other words, this binary thing does not exist. Many men and women of science are also men and women of faith. And so this brings us back to our analysis of Genesis 1:1 and Solomon's example of learning. And that is, you and I, Christians, proceeding from a biblical worldview, should be humble, vocal, and discerned aficionados of all good wisdom and learning. Now, I have just 4 very short takeaway things. The first one is, friends, don't be silenced. don't be silenced because you are not an expert. The very fact that someone or something or some organization wants to keep you from speaking means that the debate just moved outside of the realm of science. Remember, back to the scientific method. Its core practice is to ask questions and test hypotheses. And if you are not allowed to ask, if you're not allowed to speak, if you're not allowed to investigate, it's no longer science. Furthermore, don't allow anyone to silence you because of another logical fallacy, something called the fallacy of the expert. It's an argumentative fallacy that says this person is the expert, you are not, therefore you don't have a say. An expert certainly has authority. Certainly we should not dismiss them lightly, but experts can be wrong, and we can leverage the research of other experts. Number 2, be very, very careful when you speak. Nobody likes an unread, arrogant creationist. There's the Dunning-Kruger effect. We talked about that on Wednesday. We ought to have high levels of discernment and be humble, be willing to be corrected, to be widely read as best as we can. So don't be silenced, but also be careful when you speak, that you're not just vomiting out what somebody else told you. Number 3, like Solomon, we should love learning. You know how it is. There's Christians out there, and if this is your opinion, that's fine, but you can't study this. Philosophy is bad. Psychology, bad. This area of study, bad. You can't, no. We should be discerned aficionados of all good wisdom and knowledge. So let's love learning. But here's the last one. All knowledge points to a creator who points to the gospel. Look, I don't know what kind of week you've had. It's Mother's Day. And you might be thinking, okay, there's all this science stuff, but what does this matter? Here's the thing. Science points to a creator. And what do we know about this creator? That this is a timeless, eternal, transcendent, omnipotent creator who is also personal. John 1:14, this creator came down to dwell with us. And what this means is when we look at all of this majesty of creation and the creator behind it, this creator wants to know you. He wants to adopt you as a son, as a daughter. He wants to call you friend. He wants to be in fellowship with you. He wants to be part of your life. This is not a distant God off somewhere, but this is a God who is here. He loves you. He cares for you. He understands the week you've had. He understands what you're going through. He knows everything about you. And when we study him and his creation, we can give him glory. But again, this is not a far-off God. He is personal. He is here, and he cares about you. So look at the grandeur of the creation. Study it, learn it. But remember that at the end of the day, Jesus said, look, if you're tired and weary, come to me. I will give you rest. And this is what he offers us through the message of the gospel.